Chapter 20. Axis. The Earth moves at about 30 kilometres per second. That's nearly 110,000 kilometres per hour. We just don't feel any of it because the speed stays the same. You only feel motion if your speed changes, you see. Mr. Corey said to think of it like the Earth was a car we were all travelling in. Then imagine if the car accelerated or braked all of a sudden. That's when you'd feel it. The Earth would be thrown off its axis and we'd either be flung back in our seats or sent flying through the windscreen. That's how it was in the days after the refugees arrived, like we were braking and moving in slow motion. Or maybe it just felt that way because we were frozen in these wintry June days, feeling like our feet were ice blocks and our noses were about to drop off. I kept wondering about the refugees over at Point Nepean, what they were thinking of Australia and the peninsula, overlooking it all from up on the limestone cliffs and feeling the blustery winds coming in off the bay. Dad reckons they're all still protesting, Hayden said, one lunchtime, a few days after Operation Safe Haven had started. It was cold but not raining. We were all outside, bundled in our jumpers and jackets. Aidan, Kira, Jed and I were sitting on the rocks as usual, except Sam was with us too. Jed had waved him over one day after the fight with Lockie and our detention, and every lunchtime since, Sam would quietly follow us to the rocks and sit with us, but also a little apart. He never said much, unless Jed or Aidan asked him a question. I was too tired to fight about it, either with Sam or Jed. "What do you mean, still protesting?" Kira asked. Aidan cupped his hands around his mouth and huffed them into them to warm them up. He'd forgotten his gloves and beanie again. "They're shoving clothes down the toilet so they back up and stuff. They're just doing it so they'll get moved to fancy hotels instead." He wasn't the first I'd heard of protests at the quarantine station. The local newspaper had run a story only a few days after the refugees arrived with the headline, "Kosovars Trample on Hospitality." The story said that on the night they arrived, some of the refugees had got back on the bus that brought them and refused to get off again until better accommodation was found. The newspaper ran a 2-page vox pop, which Mr. Curry explained to us meant voice of the people, when Aidan brought the newspaper in to show us in class. They asked a bunch of locals from up and down the peninsula what they thought of the refugees being here and their protesting, and Aidan's dad, Bill McMillan, 41, cafe owner, Sorrento, had said one of the people whose voices was heard. And what he had to say was this: "Beggars can't be choosers, can they? If they are, then it means the whole deal is suspect." Whatever that meant. Luca had been furious about the article. He'd been out the night before volunteering at the Safe Haven again and was reading the paper during breakfast the next morning. "Can you believe this?" he said to Annika, who'd been leaning against the computer, sipping orange juice. Lucas swore under his breath. That had Sam and I quickly turning to each other, and Annika raising her eyebrow at us and shaking her head. "The paper has completely mangled what happened, or else made it up," Lucas said. "They're making out like it was an organised protest, as though the refugees were spitting in our faces." "What happened?" Sam asked. "I mean, what really happened?" "Well, there was a family with a grandmother in a wheelchair. When they found out that the shared bathrooms and toilets are nearly 500 metres away from the dorms, they got the translators to explain that they wouldn't be able to use them." Luca rubbed their hand over his beard. "That translator told the officials, who said they couldn't do anything, and it was either this or nothing." "What did they do?" I asked. Luca started rolling up the newspaper. "Whatever the refugee family could to get some help for the poor woman. They didn't want to see her soil herself in the middle of the night because she couldn't get all the way to the toilet in time, and the bathroom doorway wasn't wide enough for her wheelchair anyway."
"Wait, are the kids supposed to use those toilets in the middle of the night too?"
Annika asked, a frown forming.
"That would scare the bejesus out of me in that creepy place. Imagine asking a kid Fred's age or Sam's to go wandering outside in the middle of the night to find the toilet."
Lucas stood up so quickly that the chair fell over behind him. He strode over to the bin, lifted the lid and shoved the newspaper in, down deep. Annika was rubbing her belly with one hand, and when Luca came over, she reached her other hand up to gently touch his back. "You know what the government reps said to all that?"
"Babe,"
Annika started to say. "They said it was totally unreasonable. Complaint and suggest that they could send their family back to Kosovo if they were dissatisfied with Australia. Can you believe that?" Lucas sighed. "They gave the family a bedpan, and between that or going back to the bombings, they chose the bedpan." At the rocks that lunchtime, it was Sam who spoke up. "That's not true," he said. "Luca's been there and he knows what's happening, and he says none of that's true." Aidan held his hands up like he was surrendering. It's what my dad says. He reckons they're ungrateful and kicking up a stink just because they can. Lucas said, Sam started again, but I shook my head at him and his mouth snapped shut. Lucas said the toilets and bathroom that they're really old, I began instead. They're not shoving clothes or anything else down the toilet. It's just that the plumbing's all rusted and hasn't been used in ages. And now suddenly hundreds of people are going to the loo every day and it's all backing up. Ew, that's disgusting. I'm eating. Kira whined, and she delicately put her salami sandwich back inside her lunchbox. Luca would know better than your dad does, Jed said to Aiden, and I looked over at him with grateful eyes. Luca's the one who's been volunteering there nearly every day. Aiden shrugged. Whatever, I'm just telling you what my dad heard. Jed shrugged too. Sam and Fred are telling you what their dad saw. Sam and I looked at each other then, and I didn't know if it was Jed calling Luca our dad or just an appreciation that he'd stuck up for us. But for a second, Sam and I shared a private smile just between us, and it made me feel light and maybe even happy. But then, chasing that thought away was the memory of what Luca had said the other day, that some people in town wouldn't like the refugees coming here. That seemed true enough now.